I think today I will read in Romans chapter 1. I like Paul's epistle to the Romans. I like the writings of Paul. I think it clarifies everything else in the Bible. Paul had a revelation. He didn't sit down to write his opinions or his ideas or his theories. He had a revelation according to his testimony. Accepting his testimony, Jesus gave him a revelation. And the revelation, and by a revelation I mean a revealing of something previously hidden and unknown. In fact, Paul tells us that in his writings, that the message of the gospel was hidden. It was a hidden message, not known until, if I could say it this way, until it was accomplished. And what was hidden and not known was that Jesus would come and do for us what we could not do for ourselves, and bear in his own body the penalty that all of us deserve for our sins, to release us from that penalty. That was a mystery, and until he came and did it, it was not known how it was going to be and that it would even be done. And Paul was given that revelation and explains it in all of his writings. And he begins to discuss it in Romans chapter 1. He's talking to the Romans, and he's writing to this church at Rome, and he's never been there. He's not the founder of this church, and he's not been there. They are strangers to him, though he seems to know some of them. And he's writing to them, saying that he would like to come and preach to them. Like in verse 15, for instance, he says, "So as much as is in me, as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you at Rome also." Now, this is, if you think about it, we're so used to reading things like this in the Bible, we don't really think how it might have sounded. Here's a church already established. These are already Christians, already believers, and here's this man Paul that's never been there saying, "I want to come preach to you the gospel." You might be tempted to think, what we would think is, well, the gospel, we know what the gospel is. Well, Paul considered the gospel a message that was important for them to hear, especially the way what he had to say about it. And I've mentioned this before, I like to always point this out, that the word gospel itself is a word that means good news. He says, "I have good news for you." And if you want to know specifically, I sometimes like to just know where I could, like if a person were to challenge you, and sometimes that happens. Well, how do you know what the gospel means? Sometimes we just kind of generically think anything the preacher says is the gospel. But that's not true. Paul had a very specific thing he meant by it. And Phil, if you could momentarily, Phil's going to go and give me 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul tells us, he defines exactly, so there's no doubt about it, what he means by the gospel when he says, "I want to preach the gospel to you." In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he brings up this word and he defines for us what he means. He says, this is the conclusion of his letter to the Corinthians. He says, "Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel, which I preached to you, which also you received, wherein you stand." When he said, "I declare to you," a better translation might be, "I want to remind you." And here again, he's writing to Christians, but he says, "I want to remind you of the gospel." And now he's getting ready to tell us what it is. "By which also you are saved." That is, by the gospel, by this message. "If you keep in memory what I preached to you, unless you have believed in vain." Again, think about how bold, go back just a second. Think about how bold this is. He says, "Keep in memory what I preached to you." He's considering what he preached to them so authoritative that he said, "What I preached to you is the reason you're saved. And keep it in memory, and don't let it slip away. And I want to remind you of it, what I preached to you, unless you have believed for no purpose." And I think he means that in a kind of rhetorical sense. In other words, I don't think he really thinks that they did, but keep it in mind. Okay, the next verse. "For I delivered unto you what first of all I also received." And when he says what I received, he tells us elsewhere he didn't receive it from Peter, James, and John, but from Jesus himself. And here is what he means by the gospel. "How that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures." And that's basically it in a nutshell, that Christ died for our sins. Go back to the previous one just for a second, Phil. That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. If you stop right there, this is kind of the core essence of the gospel. If you look at that and consider what he's saying there, that Christ died for our sins, there is a little hint of, this is a message of good news, but there is a little element of, you might say, something negative there, or something, you might say, in a sense, bad news or something negative. That is, we have sins. He says Christ died for our sins. And the whole purpose of Christ dying is because we had sins. Now, sometimes you run into people, I do sometimes, who don't want to admit that we have sins. And in fact, we want to say somebody else does, but I'm not so bad. That's kind of how we look at it, But he says Christ died for our sins. Our meaning kind of a universal everybody. That's what and we're going to find out more specifically. That's exactly what he means. But sometimes I've talked to people who kind of have that kind of air about them. Well, I'm not so bad. Now, maybe the people at the prison, they're bad, and some people, drug addicts, they're bad, and people elsewhere, someone else, somewhere else, off, doing what I consider to be bad things worse than me, they're bad. They have sins. But as for me, I'm not all that bad. And I told you one time about the woman got mad at me because I used the word saved in a message. And in my defense, I just read it from the Bible. I didn't make it up. I read it. And I think that morning I was preaching from Ephesians 2:8. By grace you're saved through faith. And the woman said to me, why do you keep using this word saved? And if I was a smart aleck, and I'm getting more that way, and I might just be tempted to do it now, but if I had been a smart aleck, I would have said, well, don't blame me. Your fault's not with me. It's with the Bible. I just read it, I read it right here. Paul's one used that word. Why you might rather say, why do I keep using it? Why did Paul write it in the Bible? You don't be mad at me. Your problem is with the Bible. But she didn't like that. She said, well, isn't God love? Why do I need to be saved? What do you keep? It made her feel bad. Made her feel guilty. And she wouldn't have liked this verse either, because it said, Christ died for our sin. Oh, where did we go? Oh, yes, you put it up, Ephesians 2:8. Yeah, you're saved. For by grace you're saved through faith, that not of yourselves, it's the gift of God. Yeah, saved, it's right there. Well, saved means, when she said, well, isn't God love? What do I need to be saved for? Well, yes, that's true. God is love. But He's also just. He wouldn't be much of a God if He wasn't just. Isn't that right? If He wasn't the epitome of justice and righteousness, and if He were not a righteous judge, He wouldn't be much of a God if He were not a righteous judge. He is a righteous judge, and He doesn't overlook anything. He can't. He's omniscient. He sees everything. Some people say God can't look on sin. Oh, yes, He can. He sees it all. He knows it all. But because He's love and because He loves us and sees our sins, He sent Jesus to take our place. That's why Paul said this is the core of this good news. You might say the hint of bad news is that you have sins. And I have sins. We all do. But the good news is, and I think it's marvelous when you see it in its full scope like this. God doesn't overlook, nothing gets by, He sees everything, but He loved us so much that He sent Jesus to take our place rather than punish us. And this has another implied element to it, that it is not God's will to punish us for our sins. It was His will to punish Jesus for our sins. That's why He said this is the core of the gospel, Corinthians, and I want you to not ever forget it. Keep it in memory, and this is why you're saved. And keep it in memory that Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Now, one part of that, we have sins. That's kind of the bad. But the good news is He died for them, and also along with that, our sins have already been died for. Can I say it that way? They've already been paid for. I don't mind. I hope you don't mind if I try to illustrate the confusion that is in people's minds by telling you little stories. And these aren't made up either. I mean, that little thing I told you really did happen. And another time I was coming out of a church, Methodist church if you want to know, and we'd have Promise Keepers meeting there. And we would go around to different churches. And this one particular man was walking next to me out of the church, right out of the church building, and he said to me, out of the blue, with no preparation, with no explanation, with no context, I didn't have the slightest idea what he was even referring to or talking about. Out of the blue, this man turned to me and just said, well, he said, I know we've all got to pay for our sins. And I understand why most people think that way. That's the way most people think. But Paul, that's why he wrote to the Corinthians, he said, I want to remind you of the gospel. Remember, Corinthians, that Jesus has died for our sins. That's the important aspect of it, the important element of it. Jesus died for, the sins have already been died for. Well, again, if I'd been a smart aleck, and again, I'm getting more that way by telling